Also joining us this afternoon is Don McLain Gill. He's a lecturer at the DLSU's Department of International Studies. Professor, magandang hapon and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good afternoon.
Prof, we're a bit confused now what's happening.
Is there a war? Is there a ceasefire? Is there a...
Or that's normal.
somewhere in between?
But maybe you could talk us through, and I know you have a little bit of expertise on this, yung thought process behind this. What are the motivations and what are the policy, the policies going to look like behind it?
Right, thank you. And, question about confusion, I think we're on the right track if we're all confused. I believe there's no one that's fully aware
that's
of what
good
is
to hear.
taking place. So what we have today is a very fragile and tense ceasefire between Iran and Israel. To begin with, a ceasefire would not have been immediately palatable to Iran without given the chance to retaliate after the nuclear sites strike. Now, one can assume that the attacks on Qatar may have been an off-ramp to both Israel and Iran. So the U.S. was already relocating a number of its naval and air assets in Qatar and Bahrain before the initial strike. So the ceasefire also comes at a very critical juncture for both Iran and Israel. For Iran, its defense capabilities and intelligence have illustrated great vulnerabilities. In fact, Iran has already been arresting hundreds of individuals within its borders, accusing them of helping Israeli intelligence. And as far as the proxies are concerned, Hamas is crippled, Hezbollah is defanged, and the Houthis are demoralized. For Israel, along with the civilian casualties, prolonging this conflict would have eventually taken a toll on its economy. If we look into history, Israel is known for fighting short and blunt and quick wars, and prolonging this would eventually be counterproductive for Israel as well. However, there may be certain quarters in Israel's policy circles that may have wanted to maximize this window of opportunity to eventually derail Iran's long-term possibilities for deterrence. However, maintaining the status quo now would be of a much bigger challenge given the volatility of the situation.
But Prof, we're also hearing reports that the capability of the Iranians to enrich uranium, that has not been completely eradicated. If that is the case, if that is true, does Israel stand to gain from holding on to a ceasefire?
But what is, addition to that is, what is the real status of the capability of Iran? Because even the National Security Council of President Trump disagrees with him regarding the capability of Iran to create a nuclear weapon. Is this another weapons of mass destruction mythology like in Iraq? So who really knows the capacity of Iran in terms of which was the basis for this attack?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that when it comes to having a consistent story, even those within Washington are also sort of mixed up with the signaling regarding the capability. So in terms of the U.S. and Israeli objective, why the strikes have significantly devastated Iran's nuclear program, it is unlikely to have completely eliminated it. And this is coming from, for instance, the leaked Pentagon Defense Agency reports that were leaked to BBC's U.S. partners, and it has been out in the media since earlier today. And also nuclear policy experts, right, such as David Albright, who had also been engaged with the IAEA, says that there is a pretty good chance that a significant amount of this enriched uranium still exists in Iran. So while destroying Iran's centrifuges and infrastructure have significantly set back the program, there are concerns over the possibility of Iran using another covert facility to continue enrichment to what in remaining, the required 90% for nuclear weapons. However, the setbacks are also indismissible. They are significant. But then again, if you expect Iran to just roll over and submit to U.S. demands, I think we are sort of expecting a little too much, given, of course, that there are some certain arguments and certain schools of thought that may think that Iran now will be more motivated to ensure that it gets the nuclear bombs, particularly since it is seen as an important deterrent. So there are two contrasting views. Either Iran has been defanged and would no longer commit to it, or it would be more motivated to do so. But either way, we would expect for both U.S. and Israel to pay close attention, because if there are instances where there are confirmations of another covert facility, we could be expecting more strikes in that regard. So these are the scenarios that we're looking at right now.
But the problem is, I think the elephant in the room is that the Israeli strategy or the Israeli framework, which was for a long time that of deterrence, has now shifted to emasculation and destruction of their enemies, like what they're now doing in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen, even in Syria, and now in Iran. And this is an opportune time for them, since they have a Trump presidency and the Russians are preoccupied and the Chinese are in an intense power struggle. So this strategy will dominate, in spite of what you said, the possible economic and international standing of Israel being affected by this war. Let's call a spade a spade. This is a war. And this is not only about deterrence, this is now about emasculation and destruction of their usual traditional enemies.
Right.
So the entire situation in the Middle East almost overnight has changed.
Well, they've said it themselves. They are trying to enact a regime change, a complete regime change, right? Which is quite alarming for another sovereign country to be saying that about another country. But what are the odds that they may actually be successful at this? And, talk us through the risk assessment here.
Even overtly threatening assassination.
Correct.
With
Assassination
Khamenei.
of the supreme leader.
Right. That's a very pertinent question, Reg. And when we talk about regime change, it's easier said than done, especially when it comes to the situation of Iran. Yes, there are instances where certain parties within the U.S. and Israel have been inclined to favor this option. But again, if we look into the history of Iran, what matters most is public mobilization. If we look into the pre-revolution in the 1970s, what eventually led to the deposition of the Shah was not necessarily the blunt effect of foreign interference, but rather the discontent of the Iranian people towards the Shah and its practices that do not seem fit within the society of Iran. And more than that, the armed forces, the military defense establishment of that time were not only just divided, but some of them were completely for the deposition of the Shah. Today in Iran, it may be a little bit more different. We don't see that level of public mobilization yet. But as far as the Revolutionary Guard is concerned, it's still quite intact. There's still that balance between the clerics and the military, and at the same time, to ensure continuity, the Ayatollah has already ensured that there would be at least 3 successors, and it has been actually quite fast in. He has been quite fast in replacing those that were targeted, generals and officers that were targeted. But then again, this is not something that we are completely eliminating. All I'm saying is that it would be difficult. Even though Iran has faced a huge beating, its proxies have been scrambling, and the regional dynamics are in fact quite favorable to Israel, especially with the Syrian situation now quite different due to the change in government. Assad's not there anymore, so it has been quite favorable. But of course, Trump has also been quite frustrated with this initial. The White House had to, or rather, Trump personally had to announce the ceasefire twice, and this was prior to his going to NATO, because of course Trump wanted to be, to arrive in the setting, showing that he had succeeded. So again, it becomes a challenge between the idealistic interpretation and the goals and the objective on the ground.
But Prof, in that region, we've seen that it's easier to change regimes than it is to put in a working one. You've seen that with Afghanistan and of course
Iraq.
with Iraq as well. Di ba? Mas madaling pataubin ng tao kaysa maglagay ng bagong tatayo talaga at mag-stay.
The Americans are very weak in winning the peace.
Yeah. For example, well, I don't know if this is too simplistic, but what are the chances of going back to pre-1953 before Mossadegh was ousted in a coup? That's too far back na.
That's too far away.
Is that too?
Ed, anong kuweba ka binakatira? Saang kuweba ka binakatira?
Well, the situation has significantly changed since then, and even during that time, there was this level of discontent as well that was brewing, which eventually paved the way for the Shah to gain significant power.
Yes,
but then again, it
chunk of
relies
that was because of the U.S. and Britain over
right,
over
and it relies
nationalization.
eventually on the level of public mobilization. You think about Libya, for instance, that really worked in the favor of the West, despite the fact or the manner that it was carried out. But Iran is not Libya. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is a different entity on its own, and it has become much more sophisticated since, of course, the various precautions that they have been taking. But again, we're not ruling out the fact that this could happen eventually if the level of frustration continues and Iran decides to double down on eventually fighting back once again. Or proceeding in any policy measures that would eventually lead to concerns in Israel and the U.S. So we're obviously not canceling out that option, but all we're saying is that it would take time before such a move would be eventually successful, given the internal dynamics of Iran, because we have to take that into factor as well.
Short of asking you to forecast how this might play out, which I'm not trying to do, but when the Philippine government, when President Marcos says they are not too worried about it because it's going to have minimal impact on the Philippines, and so far they haven't closed the Strait of Hormuz yet, through which 20% of the global oil passes through. Do you buy that? Is that something that you believe in?
Well, if you look at figures, for instance, if you look at the figures, who benefits most from the Strait of Hormuz? We're all aware that it's China. China gulps up over 90% of Iran's exports of oil at a very cheap rate, which is crucial for the legitimacy of the PRC and the CCP within its domestic audience. So if the Strait of Hormuz were to close, I think the main problem would fall on China. And of course, it wouldn't be in China's interest, to have it closed, and it still has a significant leverage over Iran's policy making. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why the U.S. tried to ask China to do this in the first place. But yes, there are also some natural gas exports from Qatar that go through the Strait of Hormuz. But as far as the Philippines is concerned, we have our imports from different areas as well. But, it goes down to that partnership between Iran and China. China invested a couple years back multi-billions of dollars in exchange for cheap Iranian oil. And despite the unilateral sanctions of the U.S., China was able to slip out, and it continues to benefit from the very cheap Iranian oil, which passes through the Strait of Hormuz, through the Gulf of the Persian Gulf, into the South China Sea, which goes directly to China. So again, it would also depend on how much of a leverage China would have on Iran, and I'm just not seeing it work out. Another argument here is that if Iran decides to do this, it would actually be more counterproductive because it would be turning those countries that want to be neutral and want to stay out of the situation into its own competitors and into its own enemies, especially those with economic interests, not just the exporters, but the importers as well. So I think it would be counterproductive if Iran does that. But then again, when it's back against the wall, states have been known to enter into irrational decisions. But I don't think this should be one of them, for the short term at least.
I think irrational is absolutely the right word here.
Well,
a lot of these things don't make sense anymore.
Just one interesting tidbit.
Okay.
Because the three main ports in that area was Syria, Basra, and Bandar Abbas in Iran. And there was a time that two of those were being run by a Filipino.
Oh.
The Syrian port before the Civil War, and up to now, Basra, the Basra port. And almost near to completion was the Bandar Abbas, if not for the U.S. embargo. So there was a time when the entire region, the ports, were almost controlled by a Filipino.
Ikaw ba yun?
Hindi ko nababanggitin kung sino. No, pero that was very interesting because that region is the end of the Belt and Road Initiative of China. That's the end of the new Silk Road.
Hindi
So
ko
very
yun.
crucial yung area na yan, especially because of oil, etc. And there was a time when a Filipino was running the three important ports in that area.
Very interesting tidbit nga. But we will leave that there for now. Thank you so much for joining Storycon and for your insights. Don McLain Gill from the De La Salle University's Department of International Studies. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, man.
Thank you, Don.